All right. Hi, everybody. Again, so sorry for some of our technical delays. Thanks for being here. Uh, 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 as we go through this tonight, at any point, if you have if you have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A. And what I'll probably do is wait till the end to try to get to those versus trying to keep up with it in real time. I apologize because they're all going to look like the vast majority are going to look like they're coming from Josh Clark. So don't worry about that. But if you have a question, feel free. And we are recording, so we'll make sure that this becomes available to anyone who's unable to be here tonight. We'll make sure that we publish this. And if you're watching and you want to dig into something more and just don't have time, again, we're going to make the recording available. So again, thanks. This should only take about 30 minutes or less, hopefully, in terms of my own content. And then, again, we're totally available to answer questions you could put in the Q&A, and I'll try to get to them at the end. So let's just jump in. So the purpose of tonight is kind of twofold. I wanted to share with everybody a little bit of an update around the strategic plan, but then also kind of zoom in on two specific areas of that. It's kind of a next step in keeping everybody updated on what we're doing and where we're going and all those things. So you, I'm sure, are familiar to some degree with this illustration. This is what we've been talking about for about a year and a half, and this is just kind of that framework and outline of the strategic plan itself. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here because, again, I think we're pretty familiar with it. I just wanted to ground us in that understanding. You might also remember from the last time, which I believe was in January. Gosh, it's only been about a little over a month now, a month and a half. We got together and I shared some information around the strategic plan. And one of the things I talked about is we had these kind of guiding questions that we wanted to answer, which I'll get to again in a moment. But then we also talked about, how are we going to actually do this? What's it going to look like? So if you'll remember, we talked about how we were going to have these kind of task force around each of the key areas of the strategic plan. And that's what this represents. I think you've seen this slide before. And the idea being that there's these task force that are looking at these very specific initiatives that have to do with LBLD education, with human capital, with physical plant, with financial sustainability. And then we also have this group that's looking at how do we communicate this stuff both internally and externally as we move forward. And the idea is that the team captains for all these groups are in that center, that what we call a strategic plan cabinet. So we're able to kind of keep order, right, and kind of help these groups can go off and do work on their own, but we kind of have this centralized body to make sure that we're all kind of working in harmony and unison with each other. So what I wanted to, I don't think I shared this with you last time, so I just wanted to spend a couple minutes talking a little bit more about who's on these, what does this look like, and all those things. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because, again, we're going to share this again later. So if you have interest in kind of digging through this more, you can. And I'll also include a link to the presentation itself so you can just go back and look at this. But in that strategic plan cabinet, right, that entails myself, and it has Bill and Claire as head of the campuses. It has Dean as the director of finance and operations. And then we also have members of the board strategic planning committee that we report to and have conversations, right? And these are kind of the referees of the work. We're here to make sure that, again, when we have dueling priorities or or we want to make sure that plans are, again, working more like a symphony than a jazz band, right? That we're all kind of working in unison together. That's what that strategic plan committee is all about. The folks that are primarily looking at human capital is run by Andrea Mead over at the high school, using her kind of extensive knowledge and experience through her work at with her educational research and leadership that she her PhD from Vanderbilt. And then on there also we have Dean as Director of Finance. We have Sue as Director of Human Resources. Tara was on that original task force for recruitment and retention. So she'll be involved with this, as will other folks, right? But these are kind of the folks that we're charging with and asking to be kind of primary thinkers and doers with this work. And then over in the LBLD education, we have myself, we have Bill and Claire, we have Ariel and Megan as the academic deans from both campuses, and then we also have Adam Hickey as the director of research, kind of really truly crosses both campuses. And then under the physical plant, we have Dean in his role as Director of Finance and Operations. We have Joe as Director of Facilities. We have not identified or named this yet, but we're working on making sure that we have representatives from both EMS and the high school. And then again, of course, we have the folks working on the facilities committee. And then in financial sustainability, we have Dean for Director of Finance and Operations. We have Lisa in her role as Director of Enrollment Management. We have Michelle in her role with investment, Sue with HR, Kate in her role with outreach. We have our data analyst, Chris, because we want part of what financial sustainability is looking like is how do we take information, operational information, and bring it together more. And then that group is working with the Director of Finance or the Finance Committee from the board. And then we have this committee that I call Taking Care of Business. And this is kind of the communications committee, right? And that's that committee that's helping us think as we start to go through these plans and work through all these things, how do we make sure that we're bringing everybody along, both internally and externally? And that's Susan in her role as Director of Communications, obviously Michelle as Director of Advancement, and then we also are looking with the Advancement Committee. So I think of these are the people that are kind of primarily responsible for making sure that we continue to drive the ball down the field. It does not mean they're the sole and exclusive players. It doesn't mean it's their plan and nobody else's plan. It doesn't mean that they're the only voices at the table. It just means that they're the ones responsible for making sure we are moving things forward. And I don't think I shared this when we were together in January. So I just wanted to take a moment to highlight this a little bit more. And then I also want to take a moment to talk about how I'm asking people to think about how we process through this work, how we solve for these problems, how we design for solutions, and that's what I'm calling kind of these rules of the road. And these are so I can't see because my own screen's set up right. These are our implementation modes of thinking, right? So if we think about these as problems to solve, and it's not always that quite clear, but if we think about it as problems to solve, these are the tools in our toolbox when we go to design solutions. And so what I'm asking folks, what I want folks to do is we want to prioritize action over analysis. We certainly want to analyze things, but we don't want to have paralysis by analysis, right? We want to not only learn, but we also want to take some action so we can actually see in actual implementation what works and what doesn't. And as part of that philosophy, we're going to be doing prototyping and piloting. So instead of spending 2 years trying to come up with a massive school-wide plan for certain things, spending all this time and all this energy planning, and then implementing across 320 people, let's spend a little bit of time thinking about smaller prototypes that we can then pilot in smaller groups. Not every initiative will that make sense for, but for a lot of them it will. And so you'll see, and we'll talk about it more in a moment, again, not just thinking about how do we make school-wide changes or school-wide initiatives. Let's inform those school-wide initiatives. Let's think about how to scale something by practicing in a smaller group, right? So that we can learn. We want to make sure that we have representative, but not necessarily inclusive voices in this work. So that goes back to this idea around my decision, your decision, our decision. So not everyone's going to be at the table, but we want to make sure everyone's represented at the table. And again, those are two different things. We also want to make sure that we're thinking about how we have kind of a tendency as human beings to think about when we solve something by adding. And that's definitely a piece, right? Addition is a valid way of solving a problem or improving something, but subtraction can be as well, right? We can't just add to the plate. Sometimes by taking something off the plate, we actually get the results that we want. So that's something that we're thinking about. We want to learn from experimenting. And again, that really more goes back to that idea of prototyping and piloting. Let's try different things on a smaller scale that's a little less consequential, see what we learn, and then from there, think about how do we make things bigger and broader. We want to balance research and action. We want to preference simplicity over complexity, right? Just because something's complex doesn't necessarily make it better or more thoughtful or more effective. In fact, sometimes it's the opposite, right? So how can we value simplicity over complexity? How can we make sure that we are utilizing our human resources as they currently exist, right? How can we make sure that we are investing in the people that we have and getting the very best out of those people? Excuse me. And then we want to make sure that we have consistent communication and sharing, which is somewhat of what tonight is all about. But again, I want to share that with you. So as we move forward and you start seeing more plans, or we talk about initiatives, or we're looking at, different ideas, these are the things that are guiding the way in which we go about it, right? They're not the solutions themselves, but they're the way that we're thinking about generating them, designing for them, and then ultimately thinking about scaling them. But there are some things that we'll have to just do across the board, but when possible, we're going to try and do it in smaller stages so that we can learn as we grow it and expand it. And again, I'm going to dive into some specific examples of that in just a minute. So what I want to start with is this idea of LBLD education. Tonight, what I wanted to kind of give you an update on is LBLD education and human capital. And then throughout the course of this school year, I'm at least one more time, we'll have another update and try to share even more information. So if we look at all these things having to do with LBLD education, right? And we've talked about this before, as we talked about in January, right? We want to think about how do we really track that student journey through Landmark School? And we already do a great job of it, but sometimes it can be difficult to translate. If a student's been here for 6 years, it can be difficult to translate how we continue to measure that progress all the way throughout their journey. And that's that kind of first bullet. And then that second bullet is also about building the infrastructure where, in order to track that student journey, we don't have to open up 35 different Google Docs, right? How can we create a dashboard or create an infrastructure so that we can look at individual student progress over time, but we can also look at kind of groups of students. And by that, I mean, what does it look like for students that come in sixth grade and stay for 6 years? What does that journey look like versus a student that comes in ninth grade and leaves for the 12th grade year, and so on and so forth? What do different profiles look like, and so on and so forth? And again, it's not an exact science. Every child obviously is individual, but it's just going to help us better understand the effectiveness of our program. Where do we do a great job, and where might we find that we can do an even better job moving forward, both on an individual level and also more on that macro level? And then, like we talked about, we also want to think about how can we thoughtfully integrate instructional technology as part of our commitment to preparing kids for what comes next. So I'm actually not going to update you on any of those three tonight. That's not really what I want to zone in on, but I do for a moment. There's more to come on that. But right now, I wanted to zone in on this last one, which is considering ways of rethinking the current academic model by prioritizing teaching and student experience. And we talked about this back again in January. How do we ensure that we have the most effective model possible for our students, and that model is being kind of not perpetrated, that's not the right word, executed by the very best people, right? And that's what I want to kind of talk about for just a moment. So, zoning in on that, right? Considering the ways of rethinking the current academic model by prioritizing teaching and student experience. You've heard me say this a lot, right? One of the things that I'm really interested in is how do we incentivize people to want to stay in the classroom as much as leave the classroom, right? And you've heard me talk about right now, I think. We tend to incentivize people to leave it. So, what are ways in which we can incentivize people to stay in it, right? How do we make sure that our very best people feel like they can remain in the classroom and not be leaving anything on the table? So the way we're going to do this is this is one of these first opportunities where we're going to try a pilot. So the question that we want to answer is, right, is how might we improve student outcomes while also reducing regrettable teacher turnover? So by that, I mean, how can we get the very best people in front of our kids doing the very best job? And how do we ensure that in order to do that, we're keeping the very best people, right? That we're not losing people because of burnout, because of compensation, because of other factors, right? What are some things that we can start to play with that are in control? There's some factors that aren't, right? We can't necessarily immediately change the cost of living or things like that. I'm sorry. I just got a text asking if I purposely coordinated my sweater with the colors of the slides, and I did. I want you to know that I did. That's how much I think of you all. But in all sincerity, right? So what is a way that we can do this? uh, that we can get the ensure the very best people have the opportunity to be in the classroom, and that we keep the very best people delivering the very best program possible. So the way that we're going to go about this initially is we're going to create the small design team, which is largely going to be made up of that LBLD education committee, and we're talking about how do we consider making that a little bit more representative, and we're going to work actually with some outside educational experts. We're going to work with some folks that help design solutions for schools, that have a deep understanding of education, have a deep understanding of what we're trying to do, and how can we design some pilot experiences that involve faculty, not kids. We're not changing the kid experience, but how can we potentially change some of the faculty experience on a small scale, so that we can learn about what is most effective, is it achieving the goals that we want, and so that if this is something that we wanted to grow and expand, again, we're starting small and learning from that experience. So the plan of right now is next academic year. So in the 2024-2025 academic year, we right now we're thinking somewhere between 5 and 15 faculty members that across both campuses. So 5 to 15 in total across both campuses, who are going to help implement these pilots. It might be one pilot looks exactly the same on both campuses. I have a feeling it won't. I have a feeling we're going to design something that might make sense on the high school campus, that might look slightly different on the EMS campus. I'm even open to having two different pilots at EMS and two different pilots at the high school. Again, the idea being, how can we think about the vast talent that we have on our campus? How can we create opportunities to maximize that talent for our students, while also potentially trying to solve for or improve some of these other challenges that we have going on moving forward. So again, to emphasize in these pilots, we're thinking about how do we create opportunities for adults to engage in our learning. We are not talking about drastically changing the student experience, certainly not next year by any means, right? So this is more about how do we create new opportunities for adults. And that next one is that the goal is not to solve a problem, but to learn where we can improve. So again, the idea is not to create a solution in these pilots. The idea is to create pilots that then we say, okay, this part worked, this part maybe not so much, but in this other thing, this did work. So again, we can start to learn to create a broader solution, versus kind of trying to solve everything at once, putting it out there, and it either passes or fails, right? Because chances are it's going to fail, because that's how most things work. So instead, how do we start to learn things so that we can then improve it and then ultimately scale it? And then also, obviously, we want to prioritize student experience by prioritizing teachers. Teaching, right? So again, how this is going to be about how do we create opportunities for folks to be in front of our kids and not feel like that they're potentially leaving something behind, right? I think we should make sure that that's not a choice that people feel like they have to make. So a lot more to come on this. I would imagine by the certainly by June, my hope is early May, we're able to share out a little bit more of what these pilots might look like. Participation will likely be done through an application process. If you're interested in participating, once you have a little bit more of an understanding of what it is, and we have a better understanding of kind of the skills and characteristics that we think are going to line up well with this, for those that are interested, there'll be an application process. There will be some kind of additional compensation associated with it, right? This won't be like please volunteer your time, right? Because that's part of what we're trying to solve for too, right? Is how do we, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, but ultimately, how can we continue to improve and maintain an effective and competitive and reasonable compensation structure? And again, I'll get into more of that in a moment. So there'll be a piece of that at least tied to during an individual's participation in the pilot. So more to come, but again, headline being, we want to design opportunities for individuals who are interested and that meet the criteria put out, to help us learn about how we might be able to create new opportunities for faculty that improves student outcomes, or at minimum ensures that we can maintain those student outcomes by having our best people work with our kids and hopefully over time reduce that regrettable turnover where we have great people that have to leave. So more to come on that, but I wanted to kind of highlight that for you. By design, I don't have any specifics for you because we haven't designed it yet, right? That's one of the things that's going to come up next. Right, and then if we go from there, let's talk a minute about nurturing human capital. Again, there's a number of things. I'm going to zoom in on that second one, but I do want you to know before I zoom in on that, that we are right now in process of starting conversations about that portrait of a landmark teacher. We're in conversations about thinking about housing, right? Purpose-driven system for faculty housing, right? How do we, we talked about this, I think, a lot, but it's housing is not a universal or a universally accessible benefit, but it's a really big one for those who might have it. How do we do this? How do we think about that? And I think that also ties into that last one too about how do we think about a sustainable boarding coverage model, right? How do we how do we ensure that we're able again to give our kids the experience that we know that they need, but in a way that doesn't completely burn people out. So all those are in motion. There's more to come on that. The one thing I will say before I jump into that compensation goals and benchmarks is around the portrait of a landmark teacher, and we'll talk more about this, but I think this is going to happen in phases, right? It's just like we now have a portrait of a landmark graduate, which is aspirational, and now we're starting to have conversations about how do we actualize that. Same thing, we're not going to have one document that comes out of that a portrait of a landmark teacher that solves all of our problems or answers every question everybody has about expectations. It's going to be a process where we first understand what's our aspiration, and then what might that look like in practice, and then how do we hold each other accountable to that, and then how do we create opportunities for growth to lead more towards that aspiration. So again, this is going to be a multi-step process. I've heard a lot of positive things that people are really excited about that portrait of a landmark teacher, and I think it's awesome. I also just want to kind of couch our timeline expectations because I think this is going to be multi-tier. But for now, what I want to talk about is compensation goals and benchmarks, and chances are that's why you tuned in the first place, and I don't blame you. So, first, I don't have benchmarks to share with you tonight. I'm working on benchmarks. Potentially by the end of the school year, we'll be able to share some benchmarks, both of where we want to be and where we're at, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to share that with you tonight, but what I do want to talk about is our plans for next year, right? So as we think about our commitment that we, started, kind of stated really last year, at the beginning of last year, of how do we make significant steps to improving our compensation model for our faculty and staff. So I'm not getting into benchmarks tonight, but I will talk a little bit about what next year is going to look like. So next year, kind of the headline for the 24-25 school year, when you start to get your letters of agreement, which I'll talk about in a moment, the way we're doing this is that everyone, and I'll talk about why that is in a moment, but all full-time faculty are going to receive a $3,000 flat increase or a minimum of a 3% increase, whichever is higher for you. The vast majority of folks are going to be at that $3,000 increase, which means for a lot of folks, the actual increase that they receive percentage-wise will be a lot higher than 3%. But everyone is guaranteed, all full-time employees at minimum, a $3,000 increase going into next year. And I'll give you some historical data on that in a second. We had a lot of conversation about that, right? And what we decided was until we get that landmark teacher portrait a little bit farther, until we have some better mechanisms for this, it doesn't make a lot of sense to say, well, you get this and you get that, or you get some more and you get less of that, right? Maybe ultimately that's something that we want to think about, but we're certainly not even there, even if that was a desired state. We're not there yet. And what instead we want to do is invest in our compensation model, like we've been saying we were going to do. And so next year, again, all full-time employees, a minimum of a $3,000 increase, or a 3%, whichever is higher. And so I want to give you just some historical context for that as we're thinking about it, right? So this shows the salary increases. These are from 1819 until 24-25 until next year. I left off last year. I'll bring it back up in a second. But for now, let's look at it in this context, right? And what we want to show is, again, we're committed to this. We want to make this happen. And so historically, at least since 1819, this increase for next year at $3,000 at a flat rate is about 100% more than the highest. I think the highest we ever gave was 1,600. This shows in 1819 we're at 1,500. So it's slightly less in this trajectory. But as far as we could tell, this actually is also the second highest um, uh, uh, increase in compensation that we've given at Landmark School ever, with last year being the highest, um, which is great. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But again, I wanted to just kind of, for context purposes, show people this. The 21, 22, 22, 23, they have asterisks by them because those are averages. But in 1819, there was a $1,500 flat increase, as I understand it. In 1920, it was a $1,200 flat increase. In 2020, 2021, there's just no increase. And then in 21, 22, 22, 23, it was more averages. That's what those represent. But next year, again, a $3,000 increase. And again, to give you a little bit more context, this shows you this over the years, and then that kind of 23, 24 increases of, is kind of an exceptional once in a generation. So we wanted to include it, but I also wanted to, kind of put in context that obviously last year was an exceptional year where we had an exceptional increase from the state, so we could make an exceptional difference in salaries. We can't maintain that level of increase as things currently exist, which is obviously why this year it's not the same as last year, but it is still significantly more than what we have done in the past. And our hope is to keep on the trend of this year, right? That is our hope moving forward as we try to design more opportunities potentially in the future to further have some significant increases. At minimum, we're hoping, no guarantees whatsoever, but we're hoping that the trend that we're seeing this year and its increase compared to years in the past is a trend that we can continue to maintain. Again, no guarantees because there's lots of variables in there, but that's what we're working towards. And then we're also trying to work through and design and think through how can other aspects of the strategic plan potentially create opportunities to raise salaries even more, right? Once we have a better understanding of our benchmark, we'll know where we're at, where we want to be, and beyond kind of what we're doing right now, are there opportunities where we can do even more? But for now, kind of in summary, letters of agreement, which I'll talk about in just a moment, are going to start going out as early as this week, and I'll give you specifics in a moment. And in there is going to be a flat increase of $3,000 at minimum, or 3% if that is higher than 3,000. So letters of agreement for the high school are going to start going out this week. We have to do them in batches. So they'll start to come into your inbox this week. And then in the next week or two following that, it'll start going in batches to EMS, 10-month employees, and then we'll start to get to 12-month employees, staff positions, outreach shortly after that. So really starting now over the next few weeks, we'll start to send out those letters of agreement to everybody. But again, we all should be able to have even before that LOA comes, an understanding of our compensation for next year, because for the vast majority of us, going to be a $3,000 increase or a 3% if that is a higher number. More to come in specifics about what that's going to look like, how you're going to sign it, and all of those things. But wanted to, again, make you aware of what we're able to do and then how it's going to be rolled out over the next few weeks. We're starting with the high school since they're on break for 2 weeks afterwards. We're just trying to get that out. And then we'll get it just like we did last year, and then we'll get it to EMS and so on and so forth. Obviously, as we go forward, if there's a change and, oh, I'm in the pilot now, or I was doing this and now there's been some changes and I'm going to do a different position, we'll certainly update your LOA. But this is kind of the start of what we wanted to share. All right. last thing I just wanted to kind of share with you, right, is this kind of comes from that communications work that we're doing, but this idea of telling our story from one moment to the next, right? That's what we're trying to do. So zooming out a little bit from kind of these very tactical initiatives that are more around people, this is a little bit more about how we tell the outside world about who we are and what we do. So Susan and her team did just a wonderful job kind of outlining this for us, right? So they have this idea of 53 years of landmark branding, evolving our visual identity and enables landmark to modernize, simplify, and clarify. So, and give kind of illustrate this and drive this home. She did. I think this was so great. Her and the team put together this, which is just kind of landmark visual identity through the years, right? So from 1971 onwards, right, you can see that the kind of spirit of it and elements of it remained the same, but it evolved over time, as would be expected. And you can see in that last one, since 2014, we have been using kind of the same visual identity. That's not necessarily going away, but Susan and team are beginning to update it, and I'll show you that I think right now. So this is moving forward. One of a logo version of the logo you'll probably see more and more, right? It's a slightly tweaked, modernized version of the logo, a little sleeker. It's really just that compass rose that is evolving. And I'll show you this within context in a moment. The idea being it kind of fits within this evolving kind of visual presence that we want to continue and to perpetuate. The logo that we're all familiar with, this one right here, it's not going anywhere. It just becomes our legacy logo, right? So it will still be used in certain contexts. We're not going to suddenly start reprinting a bunch of paper or change pens or any of that stuff. Just over time, right? This will be used in again a legacy logo that will have certain contexts and certain situations where we'll use it. And this one, you'll start to see more and more. You might have already seen it in certain places and just may not even have realized it because it fits within this kind of broader evolving visual identity, which you can see here, right? A little bit more modern, a little bit more playful. You could see this kind of expanded color scheme. You could see some of these logos really trying to maximize the our beautiful location right here on the coast and all of these things. So more of this to come, but Susan and team wanted to just kind of share with everybody how we're going about this evolution. Again, it's not a stark change, it's just an evolution. And we'll start to see too is have conversations with all the new projects on physical plant projects on both campuses. We're also going to start having conversations about how do we visually, represent who we are, our story, all those things. And so when we think about our new spaces and we think about furniture and we think about aesthetics and we think about any kind of visual representation in those spaces and really moving forward, we're going to work with a group. We haven't identified who yet, but we're working to identify a group who's going to help us inform, right? Here's how we do this, right? Here's kind of the style guide, if you will, for our physical spaces, right? Not just how we format communications, but also how do we think about the way that we represent our physical space. So that'll be something that continue to update everybody on. Again, we don't even have anything to share there yet, other than we are starting. We are looking into who we might be able to partner with to help inform. Right, everything from carpet colors to furniture to window treatments to all those things in these spaces, and then eventually moving forward, so it tells our story in a way that represents consistently who we are, what we believe, and what we're trying to accomplish for our kids. All right, so it's 6:36, and I think that's my last slide. So I'm happy if you have any questions. I'll wait just a second. You can put them in the Q&A. I appreciate those of you that took the time. I hope it was helpful. Trying to again continue to work towards our commitments to transparency, and also just kind of informing you about what we're doing, why we're thinking it, and where we're going from there. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A. I'll give it just a second. Otherwise, thanks so much for being here. Um, okay, it's so funny because Josh Clark asked, who will work with the LBLD pilot development? So great question. So it's initially right now, and we're still kind of figuring this out as we go to some degree, but it's by design, the design team is going to be a small representative group just because we want to kind of put things in motions soon so that we can be prepared for next year. So it's going to be that LBLD committee, which is Bill and Claire, Ariel and Megan in their capacity as deans, Adam Hickey in his capacity as director of research, myself, and then possibly a couple other representatives from each campus. Again, and we're not solving it; we're just designing a pilot. That way we can practice, we can learn, we can see, and even as we go through it, we can continue to iterate and add and all those things. Great question. Is the pilot program for people who are faculty only, not middle managers? Great question. And this is kind of something I always find interesting at Landmark School. I think some people use faculty in the overarching sense of everybody's faculty, and some people think about faculty as primarily teaching, and then think of middle management as not faculty. I mean it as the entirety. I mean anyone that has a role in teaching and learning whose primary role has something to do with teaching and learning. That's what we're looking at for this pilot program. So I don't quote me, but I imagine it's going to be we're looking at people with at least 5 years of experience, right, who have kind of met certain thresholds that either have experience both teaching and in middle management, ideally. Again, don't quote me on that. That could change slightly, but that's the idea. And again, I apologize when I say faculty, I mean it pretty broadly. Um, so someone wrote the outside expert. Who are the outside experts? Great question. So still finalizing that a little bit, but there is one of the schools that we went and visited last year in Atlanta is called Mount Vernon School, and it is a super neat, super innovative. I'm going to say progressive. I don't mean politically progressive, but like very hands-on, very kind of future of learning school that is not LD, but supports a very large LD population. And they have an outreach program, kind of like we have an outreach program, where we but their outreach is not obviously around LD. It's around consulting with schools, partnering with schools to design kind of unique solutions like new schedules or new initiatives and all these things. And so I believe the individuals that we're going to be working with, one is the head of the school, who I know super well, who's a really well-respected person in independent school education in general. And then the woman working with him has a number of roles, but she oversaw their learning support program and also was in LD in public schools for a long time too. So it's got that unique perspective. So the 3% salary increase will only affect those who make over 100,000 at the school. Why did the team decide they needed more money in this raise than the majority of our teachers when they make more than double our classroom teachers? So the decision was made initially was we don't want to just do 3% because if I make 30,000 as an example, though I think we've been able to exceed that now for the vast majority of people. But if I make 30,000 and I get 3%, and I make 100,000 and I make 3%, obviously that's very different. So the idea was that we wanted to give a flat increase. So some people, right? Some people who make more are getting a 3% increase, and some people who make less will get anywhere from an 8 to a 12% increase. So we were trying to be as equitable about this as possible. So that's why we made that decision. How are faculty being chosen for the pilot program? Great question. And we don't exactly know yet because we don't really know what we're piloting. It is likely to be some kind of application process. But before we even open that application process, we even need to figure out what exactly you would be applying to do. So more to come on that. But it will be an opportunity for people to say, hey, I'm interested in this. Once I understand more about it, and here's why. Yeah, so Dean asked me to talk about this. Not everybody, some of you are watching this from um, later point, and you can ask questions. So we will try to create some milk break opportunities to dig into this more. Obviously, for high school, especially, that'll be after your break at this point. Um, can you tell us more about the training for Friday, and should we use it as a lens when thinking about today's meeting? That's a great question. I really like that question. So Friday's training, right? There's a couple things that are going to happen. One is just our continued commitment to our DIB initiatives in general, right? And so we're going to do some kind of best practices around what does it mean as an institution to be committed to this? What does that look like in our classrooms? All of those things. But we're also in that we're going to weave in some of the learnings that we took from the some of the learnings that we took from the need finding, where they came in and they interviewed faculty and staff and students and parents and board members, right? They're going to weave some of that and share a little bit of some of what that learning was. And I would say yes, yeah, to everything we're doing. That should be one of the lenses we're looking through 100%, right? Because part of our commitment, right, to all of this is making sure that we are creating a community where everyone, where we bolster a sense of belonging, certainly not minimize it. So I think definitely. And on that too, I very much appreciate EMS hosting. And high school, we had a very long conversation today about parking, and so we'll share more with you. Our goal was, EMS very kindly always comes over to the high school. So we wanted to try to recognize that by bringing people to the high school, bring from high school over to EMS. And then also it allows us afterwards to have a little bit more of kind of an adult party, if you will, because we don't have to worry about kids being on campus. So after the meeting, we're going to then stay on the EMS campus for those that are available. And we're going to have trivia. We're going to have some beer and wine, some snacks and all those things, just for like an hour and a half or 2 hours, just a bit of fun. That because there's no students on campus, makes it a little bit easier to do it there. So thank you to EMS for hosting, and thank you to high school for making the trek over there. All right. So again, if you have more questions, I'll be on for just another minute or so. Feel free to pop them in that chat. We'll try to arrange some milk break opportunities. You're also always welcome to reach out to me. Obviously, also welcome to reach out to whoever may be appropriate in your sphere, Bill or Claire, Dean or Sue, whoever whoever is in your sphere that's the most appropriate person. But in the meantime, especially for our 10-month employees, I'm going to call faculty, but I mean people primarily teaching and learning, expect your letters of agreement to start rolling out this week for high school, EMS a week or so after that, and then we will go from there. Oh, I'm sorry, I got two more questions. I didn't scroll down. Will there be an additional cost of living increase along with the 3,000? No, the 3,000 is the increase, right? So that is the increase. And again, it varies somewhat in terms of percentage, right? So some people will have a increase that far exceeds a cost of living adjustment. Other people, especially towards the higher end of the salary range, will have an increase that really more matches cost of living adjustment. Will Landmark explore the options of exploring outside PD options for younger teachers to attend? Yeah, I don't exactly know. I mean, my broad answer is, of course, yes. I think we need to explore all kinds of PD options. But if you want to have any specifics, feel free to reach out to me about that. So, well, thanks everybody. Have a great night. Again, reach out to me, whomever may be appropriate in your sphere, with any questions, and we'll go from there.